Okay, well, we'd like to welcome you to Introduction to Records in New England. It's kind of an important area for genealogists, particularly in the United States, because of our New England heritage. And about 10% of 8 to 10% of the population of the United States says they are from New England in census records, or that they come from English ancestors, strictly English, except you need to understand that New England was a pathway into America. People who came to America came to the ports on the East Coast. Of course, a lot of them came through New York, which is not part of New England. And let's get into looking at that. We're talking about Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Those are the New English states, the New England states and the previous colonies. So it's not like we're excluding information from the other areas because, as I mentioned before we got started, that there's a lot of cross-colony traffic, not a lot until later on, moving into the 1800s because of transportation issues. You might want to know, for one thing, is that it was many years after the United States was completely formed that there were passable and usable roads running north and south and along the East Coast. And of course, as the population continued to increase because of immigration and all of the people that were already here, then the westward expansion began and northern. It's interesting to note that the expansion and movement occurred early because there were a lot of people who left Connecticut and bought land in Vermont and Vermont, New Hampshire, up in that area. They lasted about usually 1 to 5 years because of the rocky soil and the temperatures and the short growing seasons. It wasn't really conducive to farming, and there was a further movement there into New York and westward into Ohio and Pennsylvania and other places. So, I mean, Pennsylvania first, obviously. You don't get to Ohio without going through Pennsylvania. So there's quite a bit of things to know. And as I was recommending in a few minutes before we started, is that it's absolutely essential that you read some history. I mean, you really need to get some early American history. You may have had a class or two in high school or in your college studies, but you just need to know the history of these people. You know, to know when things happened and who moved where and who was important and those kinds of things. Because getting into genealogy and going back and then starting to search for names for individuals is going to be, as I mentioned previously, almost like stepping off into the proverbial fire swamp because of the way that happens, that there are so many people with the same names and common English names, and it's just a completely different world. But as far as the family tree is concerned, there is a considerable amount of changes going on, probably more for New England ancestors than any other part of the family tree. So those are kinds of considerations that you need to be aware of just from practical situations before you get it going into it. So let's get into it and get started here. It's a good idea when you're starting to do genealogical research in New England, then we're talking about New England, and that means the colonies, what eventually became the United States of America. So it's a good idea to remember these dates. This is one time where I would really let you know that you got to know these dates, because otherwise you get into kind of unreal world out there. The records from New England from 1620 to around 1707 are English records. English records. It was part of England. So that's something you just have to accept and know. And so when I say look for Find My Past, for example, which is a big genealogy site from actually headquartered in Scotland, but is part of the British Isles, and has a primary record set for England. And they say, well, why would I look at that? Well, From 1620 to 1707, they're all English records, and you're going to start finding your people and their families in England, or not at all. So this is kind of one of the facts of life. And why is 1707 important? Because that's when it began to be called Great Britain. And now they're Great British records, because you could have records from Scotland and Wales and other places as time passed. And then to understand the obvious one, which is 1776, and you have to understand that the records didn't magically start coming from what we call the United States of America in 1776. It wasn't like there was a cutoff with all contact with England, even if there was a war going on. The people were still from England and that were here, or from the British Isles, and primary place for immigration into one of the primary places. You also have to understand that many other peoples came at the same time. There were Germans, even up to before and up to the war. There were people from the Netherlands. There were people from many different states during the time that's later than this early colonial period. The Irish were very predominantly coming to the United States. And so there's just this coming into. And so when we talk about New English records, we're really talking about basic record sets that occurred and were established back beginning in 1620. What is the significance of 1620? Well, that's why we start learning about the history of each of the colonies. So if your ancestors came and you trace some people back to one of the New England colonies, then it's very important that you understand the history of the colony. But why is that? Because records are created for genealogical records that are significant, are created at or near the time of an event that occurred in your ancestor's life by someone who either observed the event or had a duty to report the event. And the last part of this is the key here. The duty to report depended on the record sets that were created by those people who were in charge, the people who ran the counties and the colonies, and then the states, and still the counties. So it was up to knowing when those records would have started, when they continued, what kinds of records were created, what they were interested in keeping, what they were not interested in keeping. All of that had to do with the history of this part of the United States. So understanding the 1620 is important because the only other colony, the mission, Jamestown, down in Virginia, was established before that, before 1620. But since we're focusing on New England, the operative date is 1620. That's the date, the year that the people we refer to now in the United States, and we're coming up on November and Thanksgiving, and people start, remembering the iconic Pilgrims. And so we have to understand that they arrived in 1620, and there's some very complicated things that happened with that. First of all, these earliest records in New England are primarily related to their arrival. In other words, as people came, these records were created because they were here now. And so they're not, for example, you're not going to find birth records of any of the people who were on the Mayflower in New England. They weren't born here. And many of their spouses and some of their children were not born here in the United States, in America. And so the records just basically sort of pop into existence beginning in 1620. And the closer you get to that date, the less likely it is that you're going to find the kinds of records that you're used to finding for doing research in any other time period or any other place, because nothing existed. There are lots of parallel experiences around the world. I mean, you can go to many other countries and find the same issues with a group of people who went to a country that was there. Obviously, there's an indigenous population that was there that was displaced or absorbed or whatever when the various countries were formed. If you want to think of it in terms of historical, we're talking about the British Empire. We're talking about the French Empire. We're talking about Spanish Empire. We're talking about all these European political associations where they were expanding and taking over countries. And when they took over the countries, the record sets changed. So that's the key here. And if you expect to see the same kinds of records that are in England, you'll probably see some similarities, but you'll also see some differences because the record sets are far different. One of the biggest things, and this is something that you have to understand, is that people came to America for land. We often hear the official, they came here for religious freedom, which some people did. But the whole history of America, of the United States, is based on land speculation, land development, and what we would call today subdivisions. And so the process here was the royalty in England and the king or queen of England gave land grants. They owned the land. The king owned everything. So he or she, the king or queen, could give a land grant to someone, and then they became the owner of that property subject to the king's claim. And then they could sell it. And so they would go sell it off or give it off to their political cronies. And then there were other people who would come in and say, well, okay, I'll buy this from you for this much. And they would say, fine. And they would give them a deed, in a sense, to the land. And then they would come to America, or if not, or send their own officials, their own people to America to sell the land. And so that's what happened. And that's the story all the way across the United States, from New England, from the English East Coast, all the way to California. It's a whole series of land developments and subdivisions and surveys and people buying and selling land. So what you're going to be looking at when you go into the earliest records are records that dealt with land. They're going to be land grants, sales of property, transfers of ownership. They're going to be probates, where the probate cases are where the land is transferred to heirs. They're going to be tax laws and tax payments. There are going to be problems with land, disputes over land. There's going to be all this. And this is the basis for the research that you're going to be looking at to the most extent. And the rest of it's going to be a lot of administrative and kind of governmental type things that the individual small towns and counties and colonies were involved in. What we're looking at here in this picture is the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which was signed between those people who came to America for land development purposes and those people who came here for quasi-religious purposes. And so they needed to come down and make an agreement before they stepped out onto the land itself as to who was going to do what and who was going to get what. And so really the history of this early history, as you're going to find, is wrapped up in who got what land. And when they came second, they were secondary landholders, and on and on and on. Okay, so it gets more complicated. Okay, let's kind of move along. Understanding this is very, very, very important, because this part is the beginning. And the beginning is that only 53 or so of the Mayflower passengers and only half the crew survived the first winter. Now, the question comes back, well, what about the others? Well, they all died. Did they have any children? No children. Okay, so they were dead. And the only half the crew, well, what happened to the crew? The crew got back on the Mayflower and went back to England. Now, why did they go back to England? It's very simple. The Mayflower and the people who were on the boat went to the wrong place. They thought that they were going to Virginia, and they thought they had already had a contract to go and get some land in Virginia. They ended up landing in Massachusetts, and the people who owned the land in Massachusetts didn't know they were there, and they didn't have any claim to any land when they landed. So they had to send somebody back, which is why the Mayflower was anxious to get back and take back the people who needed to go back. And they negotiated so they could get some kind of agreement that they would own some land under the Plymouth colony. And so they began that process. So that's kind of the overall issue that was happening back there. Now, what about these 53 passengers that, let's say, so here's a list of those 53 passengers. Let me just say this is something that there is absolutely no, at zero, no controversy. There is nothing about these people that isn't already, I'm going to say, etched in stone. I mean, there's no controversy about who these people were and what we actually know about them. And most of the people on that chart, on the list of the people that survived, we do not know. I'm going to replay that. We do not know their parents. We do not know even where they came from. Now, why was that? That's where I'm telling you to go back and read some history, because you have to know that the people who ultimately ended up on the Mayflower and came to America in this first group basically were either going to be arrested or had been arrested or had left the country of England. And many of them had been living in the Netherlands for years because of their religious beliefs. And as happened with one of my ancestors, they married people in the Netherlands. And so the people who are in my direct line, there's one direct line to the Netherlands, but we have no idea. And my two people prominently are Francis Cook and Richard Warren. And there has been more than 100 years of research done on these people, and nobody knows who their parents were, and nobody agrees. So when you start assigning parents and you see people on Family Search assigning parents to this list, you better make sure they are in agreement with where these records come from, and that is the Mayflower Society, or the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. This is a very old organization since 1897, and they have spent millions and millions of dollars, I am sure, and all of this time doing research on these 53 passengers and their descendants. And that is not under controversy. There is no wiggle room in there. You can't go in and say, well, my records show that, because you're not going to come find records that aren't already in the Mayflower Society records. And so basically there's the book. You start with this, there's no controversy. And so this is what makes it sort of existentially a little bit weird. And that is that you get into the Family Search family tree and you're finding people putting in different people in families and changing dates and adding marriages and claiming these people are married and claiming ancestors for these people and things like this. And apparently they've never looked at the books. And this is the books. And so, oh, by the way, there's a little bit of wiggle room here because we don't really agree. Not everybody agrees that there were 53 passengers who survived. The number is sometimes 51 and 52. But that's neither here nor there. So this is the book. These are the set of books, and it's continually being updated and published and revised. And so if anybody has any new information, it goes through a tremendously strict examination period before they will acknowledge that perhaps this person had this person's wife was her parents or whatever. So this is where you would start. And by the way, the pedigrees from the Mayflower families through 5 generations is on Family Search. It's in the genealogies section of Family Search. So you can actually search in there by the names and see the what's known from the Mayflowers. And I would recommend you go look at the books. And the books, if you're actually interested in doing, and you think that your ancestors came across in the Mayflower, then I would, and you're serious about it, go out and buy the book. You can buy them. They're expensive, but it's worth it because you have right there in your hands, you have 5 generations of descendants for each of these families. Every exhaustive person that they can do, and they're working on the 6th generation continually. So it won't be too long out there. I mean, maybe not in my lifetime, but it will be at some point in time that the Mayflower Society will say, we have now got 6 generations of all the people who are descendants from the Mayflower. And if you wanted to join the Mayflower Society, if that was some idea that you had, then you would have to actually use the word loosely here, show through your very careful and documented research that you connected to one of these people. But you're wasting your time if you keep going back through the past 5 generations down from the Mayflower. You're wasting your time to do any research, to do anything but to go into these books and copy out the people that exist there. And they're all, I'm going to have to say this, they're already all in the family tree as far as I'm guessing that. So if you just know that, then why are you spending your time doing all this and adding things and worrying about who's who in the Mayflower? There should be no changes on those people at all. Okay, so this is it sounds like, well, yeah, James, you're in a kind of a tirade here, and the answer is yes, because I've had to deal with this since maybe I started about 42 years ago. Okay, first of all, and this is something else that you need to be, and we're still in number one of things we need to work with. And that is, we need to know that you're going to be overwhelmed with the number of sources. Most of the time when you're doing research, you run out of sources and you feel like you just can't get any, there's got to be more records. I can't find anything because these records just seem to be elusive. They're not available, whatever. And that's just not the case here. Here's one of the reasons. One of the things to know about also is the New England Historic Genealogical Society, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And the New England Historic Genealogical Society has a website called American Ancestors. If you're doing research in New England, then you need to have a subscription to AmericanAncestors.org. And that is the website that has all of the information. I'll get to that in just a minute. But the answer to that is yes, it is a partner program with Family Search, but the Family Search portion of access to the records on American Ancestors is very small. It's not anywhere near even a good percentage of the records. So there is a very good reason for having a subscription to American Ancestors if you are doing research in New England records. So let me show this first book that comes up. This is a book by Robert Charles Anderson, and he is the named person in a group of people that spent years and years and years combing through every available record in New England, beginning with the 1620s and the Pilgrims migrations to 1633. This book is called The Great Migration Study, and there are 2 great migrations, at least 2 in the United States, but the other one is African American migration. But this Great Migration, is simple. This book and this program, which is on American Ancestors, documents every known individual who lived in essentially Plymouth Colony or came through Plymouth Colony in New England, and most of the people from New England, from 1620 to 1633. So those people that were coming to America in this early time period are all identified as much as possible with all the records that are available. It's very important to understand this is not speculative. This is not anything. These are documented to the point of where it's possible to find the records or do it by professionals who worked on this for an extended period of time and have found every person that they could find. And now they're carrying that back. And that goes back from 1620 back to 1640. So another 7 years. But obviously the number of people in that next group are in greater numbers than the ones in the first group. So this is another book that came out in 2015. So if you're not aware of these, then you're missing the whole point, because this is not, there's not a controversy here. These have been done. And also understand that there's a handbook for all this. It's called the Genealogist Handbook for New England Research, published by the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And it will tell you all this information. And no, because it was printed in 1999, it is not out of date, because old records didn't change in the last few years, and probably never will, obviously. And then there's one other, and that's the Genealogical Register. And this is a publication, this is a journal publication that comes out quarterly, and basically has the first 50 volumes has a subject index, an index of places. So you can go in here and look for people in that, and then you'll find extensive articles, occasionally extensive articles talking about all the evidence that exists for a certain family. In other words, we're not talking about doing New England research as something that, oh, you just have to learn how to do it and you have to know all this stuff. And if you go out and you've got to find your own research, you've got to go through everything. And the answer is no. The first step in this is to go on to, don't go into family search, because the names are being, the numbers, dates, and places and people are changing constantly. But if you go to these original records and review and start with this kind of information. Now, here's the catch. The catch is some people go on and they find their surname. So, for example, they find a surname that goes back, Potter or some other Tanner or some other name that goes back into the colonial times. And then they say, well, they must have come from Massachusetts, and they must have come from the Pilgrims. So they start looking at the Pilgrims, and they do all the research down following a Pilgrim name that they have in common with some of the Pilgrims, and then they try to do the research back and connect it. That's just exactly backwards of how things should happen. The real way to do this is to do your research, but when you begin to get into the 1700s, I would start looking at these books and all the information that's already available, because it may save you a great deal of time. In my family, for example, they're called the key person, and they're people that where the information from that particular family has already been determined. One of my great-great-grandmothers going back is Thankful Taft, and she is in the records of the Mayflower Society as a certified descendant of the Mayflower. So all I have to do to prove my Mayflower connection is to go back and substantiate a collection to Thankful Taft, who married a Tanner. And so therefore I can do that. And that's what's been done from my family since long before I was born. So there was no question. Now, what happens? I follow that line back and I find people changing all the information back and forth all the time. Well, okay, fine. That doesn't change the facts and the realism of the fact that these books exist, the societies exist, and that's how the records are done. And by the way, you'll never exhaust all the sources. There are hundreds of additional books, and the records are exhaustive. And even if you run out of online records, which is possible, there's still digitizing projects going on. American Ancestors, the NEHGS people are still digitizing more records, getting more records. And they have a huge library in Boston of more records. And so there's still records that you need to look at that are perhaps not digitized, but there are enough there that you will probably spend a great deal of time looking at them. So in this case, and I find this sort of generally speaking, there are no real limits to the genealogical research. In other words, you get to the point where finding more records is impractical because you don't know enough to know which records could be available, or because the records that are available are not accessible. That means they're stuck in some library someplace and you don't have the time or the inclination or the money to go there and spend months or weeks looking through their records. Or they are basically just do not exist. The type of records that you're looking for don't exist. And that's possible the further time when you get back. By the time you're back into, by the way, the 1500s, your chances of finding any new records that somebody doesn't already know about are pretty slim. And accessing those records, by the way, becomes very easy, much easier if you get back into the early 1500s in the medieval period, because presently a huge number of the records, almost in some instances, some countries are very ahead of others, but a lot of those records are now digitized and available in various collections online. And I'm not saying they're all free. You may have to pay to get records to it. It's just like this possibility. I mean, if you're serious about doing New England research, you really are going to be serious enough to pay your dues and join the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And if you're really serious about doing the research, you're going to buy silver books and those kinds of things. So there's going to be some parameters that are going to involve more than just searching online and having a free subscription through Family Search. These are the three big programs that have New England collections: Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past. There are some records on MyHeritage. There are some records on other websites. There's hundreds of other websites that have possibility of having records, and the organizations, the states there directly. If you want, for instance, if your people came from Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Vermont or wherever, you should be very well acquainted with the fact that there's historical societies beyond, other than the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Each one of the states has a historical society, their counties' historical societies. In many cases, there are city, town historical societies, and they all have records. And they may have more records than in finding this. And so this is very important to get into this in a way that maximizes the possibility that you're finding the right people and you're talking about finding these people. Okay, so NEHGS, or New England Historic Genealogical Society, was founded in 1845, and it published the first issue of the New England Historical and Genealogical Record in 1847. And by the way, digital copies of those records of the historical register, the ones that are no longer in copyright, are available online and can be searched online. So you can go back through all of these old ones. One of the best places to look is archive.org, archive.org. And if you start looking from Google for the new registers and put in archive.org as one of your search terms, you're likely to find a digitized copy of the register. It's, by the way, called the Register now, rather than the New England Historical Genealogical Register. And they have a database of over 100 million names with vital records, compiled genealogies, scholarly journals, all sorts of other resources. And this is the oldest genealogical register in the world. Here's Ancestry, and they have searching the register from 1847 to 2011. So why would you do this? Well, you may find somebody has written a long scholarly sourced article that talks about your ancestor or your ancestor's family. You may not be happy with what you read, but you may very well find that information is available here in the New England Register, in the NEHGS register. Now, the nice thing about it is that many of the colonial era records have been preserved. There's lots of these records available. And as I mentioned, you'll probably never run out of places to look. It may take you more time than you can devote to this, to any one line on your ancestral. But maybe if you get caught up in that, you'll be looking for it. But I think you'll find as you go along that even if you think there's any controversy or anything that you think you've found that's new or changes whatever's happening, that it will probably be something that is not exactly new. It's just simply you didn't realize that it was all there already. So it's not like you're doing a big discovery here. It's more like you're going to be confirming a lot of the work that's been done previously by people who are competent and have done the research, especially those who have looked for lines back to the Mayflower. So what you're going to be looking for are what I mentioned a while ago, and that is you'll be looking for death records, birth records after the people came here, obviously, marriage records, and they're going to be primarily in what are called town records. And those are the records that are kept like a journal of all of the activities that go on in each of the little towns that have a town record. And you'll find those on Family Search a lot of times. If you look for the place, of course, we always start with location that anything occurred, where events occurred. And so when we're looking for places, the first thing we'll see is an entry for in a catalog list of town records, and that's going to be your primary source. The first question that always comes up is, well, is there an index? And the answer is not too many. I haven't ever run across an index of the town records. And yes, what you have to do is start at the time period you're looking for. It makes sense if you read them from front to back, but you could go backwards in them and find, and then it makes some sense. But they're there chronologically, and if you look through, and you're going to have to end up reading the whole thing, you may find just dozens of references to your person and never have anything that tells you substantially who or who they were married to or what they owned or anything. It's just you may have to read just through a whole thing before you can get this picture of who your person was. And that's why it's a little bit difficult to do this from just walking into it stage, and why it'd be a good idea to start looking through all of the work that's been done and be very well aware of the silver books and all of the 5 generations down and all of those things, because that will help you to at least have a way to get into it more quickly. Church records. Okay, obviously they came here because of the church. The Pilgrims were called separatists. That means they had left the Church of England when they were in England. They then began their own church organization, and the name of the churches, the group of churches that are the historical connection back to the Pilgrims, are congregational churches. And the congregational churches are scattered all over New England, and they're still in existence. Now, all of your ancestors may have over time not come, even if they came in the 1600s, they may not have been Congregationalists, and they may not have, or they may have been Quakers, they may have been Baptists, they may have been many other separatist types of religions away from the Church of England. But what happens is that each one of them has a different way of keeping their records, and maybe they did and maybe they didn't. My ancestors, the Tanner ancestors that did come to Rhode Island, were Seventh-day Baptists. And if you're familiar in the East, you may have once in a while seen a Seventh-day Baptist church. They're still in existence. But unfortunately, back in those days, the early days, the only thing the Seventh-day Baptists kept were the lists of members. They didn't record births, marriages, or deaths. So there's just no records showing who the people. You find names, but you don't ever find families. And so you have to use the land records and the probate records. And the real key are the probate records, because often if there's a will and there's a probate, you can be able to put together a family. But this is what's been done in a lot of the cases through these early records that I mentioned, like the Great Migration series and the Silver books, the books that from the Mayflower Society. And there are others. There's dictionaries of books that were created. When I use the term dictionary, that's used to reference a type of reference where they listed all the names of all the people and how they were related. And so those kinds of things, those kinds of helps exist out there. And just to kind of indicate, New England has thousands of compiled genealogical records. There's books If you get into the histories of the towns, there's sets of biographies of the early inhabitants. There's genealogical histories of surname histories of all sorts of families out there. A lot of these are available on the Internet Archive, or you can be found on WorldCat. These are the two search engines, big, huge collections of records. The WorldCat, if you're not familiar with the WorldCat, you should be. And if you're going to do New England research, you very important that you use these two resources. One of them is a catalog. So WorldCat is a catalog of libraries and other organizations around the world, 2 billion plus catalog entries. And basically doesn't get you to the information. It tells you where the records are, where the books and all of these different records are. And it'll tell you which libraries they're in. So if you put in your zip code, for example, it tells you the nearest libraries that would have the records that you're looking for. And if you happen to be lucky like we are, fortunate, I says luck didn't play a part, but fortunate like we are, we have a huge library right here, only 10 minutes from our house. And so we are able to find things if we need to. So the other one is the Internet Archive, and this is now the largest collection of digitized books and records that I know of in existence that is completely accessible. There's other collections, but they're not accessible. We always talk of the Library of Congress as being a large library. Yes, it is, but to get to the books is a very time-consuming process. Here, this is searchable, and every word by word of every one of these more than 39 million records, our books and publications are available here on the Internet Archive. It's archive.org, archive.org. Okay, so those are the ones that are the most useful. And when we start getting into records in New England, we need to know that deeds are the keys to that. And so we need to be able to read these deeds. And yes, this is what some of them look like. And no, I'm not going to be helpful when you got something that looks like this, but you may be able to get some information out of that. And always look for probate records. Now, probate records are not going to look like the one in the image here. They're going to look more like the one before with the deeds. But those probate records are the key to finding the families and connecting the individuals. In the case of my remote ancestor, William Tanner, who lived in Rhode Island, the absence of anyone being able to find a probate record leaves a lot of speculation open as to who he was married to and who his children were, and that is where the problems arise. Newspapers are helpful. There are large newspaper collections out there. We have presentations online. I'll be doing a presentation shortly on newspapers, and shortly meaning by the end of the year, I think. And their first newspapers, it was called Public Occurrences. This is not a copy of that newspaper. It only had a couple of editions before they shut it down because it wasn't official. And so this is really one of their earliest ones, was 1721. However, there's a large collection of these newspapers beginning in 1690, listed in the Library of Congress, chronicling historical American newspapers. And this is a website, loc.gov, G-O-V, Library of Congress, and it's a digital collection, and it comes up and you go to Chronicling America and you have access to searching millions of newspaper pages for free. This is not a public, obviously it's Library of Congress, so it's a freely accessed website. And then they have a directory, and that's the directory of newspapers, most everything that's been identified. Now, there may be others outside of this, but this is one huge collection of the directory of records that of newspapers that are, and when they were published and where they might be available. You always will need to look for records in libraries, archives, university special collections, and private collections, because there's going to be more records. And you have a lot of colleges and universities throughout New England, and each one of those is going to have their own collections, and they may have a collection of records that help you. And that's the importance of WorldCat, because worldcat.org gives you a way to look at all these libraries collections, a lot of the library collections at once. And remember to work from yourself going backwards in time. Don't turn it around and start doing research down from somebody you think you're related to through family traditions. So don't assume your family tradition is correct. Just do not. Unless you have actually done the research or someone has done it and you can read through and see every source that they ever cited and everything that they did, I wouldn't trust it. And I would never suspect that it was correct. They simply did not have the resources 100 years ago or 50, even 50 years ago, that would enable someone to do really accurate work back there. Most of the resources I've talked to, I've only become available in the last 15 to 20 years or more. So it's not something that your great grandmother would have done and would have done accurately. That maybe they did, and maybe it's correct, but I wouldn't assume that it was correct until I looked at what it said. And what I've said earlier is that, or what are called revolving door ancestors, it's pretty easy on Family Search. If you look at an individual, you'll see that says it's the change log. It'll tell you how many changes have been made. If you click on the expanded page and look how many changes are being made to an individual, and you scroll down and you see it's page after page after page after page of changes, working with one of those individuals is going to be extremely difficult, because anything you put in, even if you have solid gold sources, is probably going to end up being changed pretty quickly. So it's kind of the problem. So you can see here's an example of one of my ancestors, and you look at the dates. The death date was changed on March 17th. The birth date was changed on March 17th. The death date was changed on March 15th. The birth date was changed on March 15th. The event changed. The marriage was changed on March 15th. The event was deleted on March 15th, and so forth and so forth. So in other words, you're going to find things like this. And if you do, then, you have to be thick-skinned and be absolutely sure of your research, because no matter what you put in, it's going to come under scrutiny and probably be changed unless it agrees with the ultimate resources and the records. So, it's just a matter of being careful. Okay, so this is the other problem, and that is to watch out for people with the same name. If you look at this as the beginning of 177 people on Family Search with the same name, and if you look at this carefully, you'll see that the birth in the first one is 1670, the second one, this name is 1671, there's another one in 1670, there's another one in 1685, another one is from 168 to 1979. And so, what does that mean? It means that they were born, it's actually couldn't be earlier than 1626. But anyway, there's the kind of things that you're going to find when you get there. And as I usually encourage everybody to focus on the location, be really careful to look to see that the towns and places are consistent. You should always have your map, either Google Maps or some other maps program open. And every time a place is mentioned, you should look it up and determine how far it is from the rest of the stuff. And you'll find out that they're pretty much focused, and people didn't move around a lot. They may move. They're more mobile than some other, lots of times, because the younger generation, for example, because the oldest son always inherited the property, then the younger sons in the property can usually pick up and go someplace else. So it's not that there's no movement, but it better be consistent and logical. And don't be surprised if you have an end of line, because the main issue here is, where did they come from in England? It's entirely possible to research somebody back to the 1600s if that's when they arrived in New England, but to go back to where they came from, is the real trick. And here's the reason. That is because one half up to two-thirds of the European immigrants to the 13 colonies between the 1630s and the American Revolution came as indentured servants. They also came as convicts or as slaves, enslaved people. So basically, those people didn't have genealogy. And it's another subject, but it's a reality that you're going to find that there are a substantial number of end of line situations that are just simply not going to have any information, further information about that individual. And just understand that not all the records, in fact, only a small percentage of the records are actually digitized on the large online websites. They may look like they have billions of records, but when you get down to it, you'll find out that there's still a lot of records outside that. So keep looking, and thanks for watching.
Elder Tanner, we have a couple of questions I just want to have you cover. Maybe you did. Someone asked, are the Mayflower family's books on the Internet Archive?
No, they're proprietary and they're published by the Mayflower Society, but they have been digitized. They're in the process. They're not all digitized yet, but they're in the process of digitizing the set and putting them on American Ancestors on the NEHGS website. That's another good reason. For the cost of one of those books, you can have a nice subscription to the NEHGS for a long time.
Bill asks, is there a best historic gazetteer for early New England?
There are lots of them. And that's where I say that there's just an overwhelming amount of information. Right now, the best place to start is with Google Maps or one of the online mapping programs. And then from there, there's a step off. Most of the maps available are digitized. That's one area where there's an overwhelming amount of digitization. It's hard to find a place on the earth that doesn't have a digital map. So yeah, I would start with looking up and places online. And yes, if you look for the gazetteers, you'll find more listing of places in New England or Massachusetts, usually by state, like Massachusetts or Rhode Island or whatever. But if also Wikipedia, by the way, will have descriptions of almost every town in the United States. I seldom find a place in the United States that doesn't have a Wikipedia entry.